As Shireen said, this whole exercise came about because we realized that there was a major knowledge deficiency about inequality. And here we're departing from the income inequality story to a more multidimensional approach, which basically means that we have to look at human capital, health and education, living conditions, and relate that, whether in outcomes or opportunities, to the debate that we had earlier on income, and then try to explain these stylized facts by, well, I guess a political economy approach. That's basically what I'm going to try to run through right now. Data sources, 12 countries, DHS, MIX, and PAPFAM, building on the Arab Poverty Report with Oxford. So basically, when it comes to our approach, is basically we had this data, we had a lot of harmonized data sources, so we said, well, this was an excellent opportunity for us to build on. It starts from the early 2000s, ends around 2011 to 2014. So we haven't yet captured the impact of a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing. So the purpose here is not to give you the most up-to-date situation about inequality in its multidimensional form, but to tell you that the story from that, during that time period, it was a very interesting time period, was as follows. Okay, so when it comes to human capital, everybody agrees that there are development gains. You look at the HDI, you look at the MDGs, SDGs, you look at life expectancy, mean years of schooling, classified by different types of Arab countries, and you're going to see this picture. So that's basically conventional wisdom number one. What we try to do is to look at the gaps between rich and poor, in gender, rural, urban, so many different facets, and to look at them in terms of key basic indicators of health and education. So what you see here is basically the average annual change in that indicator of inequality, which is the ratio between the richest and poorest quintile over time for each country. And you can see most of the countries here are clustered in that upper left quadrant, which is the good news. That basically means that you have less inequality with higher achievement in the majority of these health and education indicators. The result, basically, is that we've witnessed reducing inequalities between the rich and poor in many of these indicators. That's a key outcome. So, for example, youth secondary education, if you're looking at the earliest survey years, the average difference, the difference between the richest and poorest was 6-fold in terms of completion rates. That's almost half by the time we come to the latest surveys. Similar reductions are witnessed in many of the other basic indicators. So that's the good news. You've had both achievement, human capital investment, human capital achievement, along with a reduction in inequalities. Huh? And that's consistent with what you're going to find, I think, in a couple of days or so when the Human Development Report gets launched. We've borrowed from their data set to show that these results for the Arab countries, which you see in red, are consistent with the rest of the world. They're not spectacular, but then, they're almost in the mean of the global performance. Gender story is also pretty good in terms of health and education, and Russia will comment on that later. But despite the gains, the level of inequality in education is still high. If we look at the inequality in education index from the Human Development Report database. So the level itself is pretty high. The other piece of not so good news is that when you correlate between poverty, multidimensional poverty index, and the levels of inequalities in terms of rich and poor quintile achievements, you'll see that the poorest countries bear the highest of the brunt of inequality. The other interesting finding is that we're trying to introduce in this report the concept of overlapping inequalities, multidimensional inequalities. In a sense, we're comparing between extreme groups. So we look at, for example, the poorest families, the poorest quintile families, and whose head of household is not educated, versus the richest quintile and post-secondary. And there's where you find that inequalities are quite significant, and they haven't actually declined in most countries. In some countries, sorry. In the case of, for example, I believe the countries aren't showing here, but I think in the case of Jordan, in the case of Morocco, and in the case of Sudan, they have been increasing. Okay? Now we come to the interesting part. So this is the outcome story. The interesting part is when we move to inequality of opportunities, we look at the same indicators, we look at them over time, we find that, well, as we would expect for health educations, the similarity index, which basically explains the proportion of inequality that is attributed to circumstances beyond one's control, is lower than what you expect for secondary education. But it hasn't been decreasing, neither for stunting nor for secondary education. And secondary education is notable because that's what, if you recall the earlier slide, that's where we saw the most spectacular gains in terms of outcome reduction. And that's what I would like to refer to as the new Arab inequality paradox. There are many explanations for that we can think of, but that's to be debated. Okay, so basically then, that slide is, I think, telling a very important story, which is basically that most Arab countries are in a situation where they have witnessed declining inequality of outcomes in many indicators, but not so much the same in terms of opportunities. This is basically the quadrants here. What you have is on one axis, on the y-axis, you have the change in wealth ratios and in terms of the change in inequality of opportunity, and you have on the x-axis the inequality of outcome. And you can see here that you have much more reduction in inequality of outcome in terms of outcome rather than in terms of opportunity. So again, this is the major stylized facts. Now in terms of the decomposition of the Shapley decomposition of the sources of that inequality of opportunities, you can see that two sources here: the wealth of the family, okay, number one, and the status of education of household head. Those are consistently the most important factors that are driving the inequality of opportunities. And it's in many countries, not in all countries, not that they haven't changed over time, but that's also one of their major findings, whether in health or in education. So basically the summary here is that Arab societies, and especially youth, are more equal in terms of education and health outcomes, but they face increasingly less equal opportunities, especially in higher education. So that could be the motivation behind the sense of frustration that could be underlying a lot of the political uprising. So I think this is the major contribution of this report, is that it tries to build a narrative that basically doesn't just talk about your income, but also talks about the other facets of inequality. And then when you bring them in with the income discussion, which I'm not going to repeat because we already did that, then we start to see, again, when you look at all kinds of stories on income, that there could be a political economy narrative. And this political economy narrative, the report goes into details of explaining the drivers of this lack of congruence or lack of convergence between the inequality in human capital story and the inequality in income, which, as we say, very well could be increasing in this region specifically. So we're talking a little bit about the labor markets. Of course, we know that we have many structural problems in labor market. Unemployment rates, especially for youth, are not are very high compared to other countries. We know that the productivity rates are very low. We know that the average employment elasticities for this region are high, which basically means that jobs were being created, but they weren't being created in formal private sector jobs. That's the key issue. Decent jobs were not being created. Why is that? Because there's a lack of structure transformation. So it goes back to the problems that we have in terms of our economic story. Now, we turn to the political economy narrative behind that. We know that the taxation systems are regressive. We know that that has to do with the rentier systems and the old social contract. We also know that there's low representation and governance problems that come along with the low representation, low taxation model. And we also know that this old social contract is now under pressure because of the high and rising debts that we see in many countries. That basically means that we have less fiscal space for social expenditures and rising out-of-pocket expenditures on health and education. So basically, we have these narratives, the two competing narratives. On the one hand, you have a narrative that tells you that we were fine, everything was okay, low extreme poverty, low inequality, and you know, great performance on human capital. But on the other hand, you have governance deficits, and who cares? If you already, if the system is delivering, then the governance is not really important. But you have a narrative introduced in this report which basically tells you that the system of political economy and inclusive development has broken links. And it has broken links in many of its facets, okay? So in this situation, the report is basically saying two things to conclude. One is that going forward, Arab countries need to improve their institutional and governance architectures. And the motivation to do that in order to reform these broken links could actually be the declining rents per capita that you see here. You remember Paul Collier in the last ERF conference mentioned that if you look at these figures, they could hold the key for the future reforms in the Arab region. With the dwindling rents, there will be an incentive for reform. So we're hoping that that will be the case. Otherwise, there could be more of a business as usual, and you can see the correlation between conflicts and declining governance may continue. So I guess these are some of the report's main findings. I know it's been a marathon. I probably haven't given enough attention to many of the details, but maybe my co-authors here would like to shed more light on some of these aspects. And thank you.